So, over the last couple of weeks, we have been entertained with the Olympics. Over in Paris, France, there were 10,000 athletes from all over the world of numerous countries competing for the gold medal. And yesterday, I was even entertained by the men's basketball team, the USA men's basketball team, as they squared off against France for the gold medal in basketball. And spoiler alert, USA won. So, all right, another gold for Team USA. When I was younger, I've always dreamt about being an Olympian, wearing the red, white, and blue, representing my country in the greatest event in sports. Sadly, the closest thing that I've ever gotten to the Olympics is, well, video games. Or sometimes during vacation Bible school, they pretend that we're having the Olympics as our big theme. And what was it? We had like four different countries that we would represent. And what was it? Everyone made a big argument about who could be Team USA. And they said, well, no one's going to be Team USA because then some people don't get to be Team USA. So it's like, okay. So, but but I got close. The closest thing I've ever gotten in terms of real life Olympics was playing sports throughout my childhood. I just loved playing sports, whether if it was basketball, football, soccer, whatever. And several of my coaches have talked about this particular stats, this particular unique fact when it comes to game performance. They would say that your performance in a game dictates 20% of your skills, but then 80% of your heart, your attitude. So I'm going to say that stat again. It's 20% skill, 80% attitude determines your performance in a game. Because your attitude can judge how you play your game. So you could be the best player on the court, best player in the world, but if your attitude isn't right, it doesn't matter how good you are. Because when it comes to a game, let's just say you're down by 20 points. Like if you're playing basketball, you're down 20 points in the third quarter. How are you going to react? Are you just going to stomp off, quit the game? Or you're going to fight back and do everything you can to win the game? How hard are you going to work to get your team the victory? And in today's message, we're going to be seeing Nehemiah's attitude when he is faced with difficult circumstances. So we are going to be looking at Nehemiah chapter 6, where we see the completion of the walls in Jerusalem. But we also see that the enemies of Nehemiah are still plotting to strike Nehemiah. In previous weeks, we have seen the enemies of Nehemiah, they're Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, are wanting to stop the work of the walls. And they believe that Nehemiah was looking to build a rebellion against the king of Persia. And we're going to see today that throughout this project, Nehemiah always went to God in prayer. We've seen that in the past, and he still does it here in chapter 6. So we're going to be looking at Nehemiah chapter 6 today. So our first point today, we see a meeting with Nehemiah. Again, a meeting with Nehemiah. And this is in the first 4 verses. So I'm just going to read that really quick here. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors in the gates. Sanballat and Geshem sent this message: "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messengers to harm them with this reply, or messengers to them with this reply: "I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. So we see Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the enemies of Nehemiah. They find out that the walls are done, that this project that Nehemiah came to do has been completed. And so they decided to send a letter to Nehemiah saying, "Hey, how about we meet up? Let's meet in one of the villages in the area of in the plain of Ono." But the thing is, Nehemiah says, "Wait a second, they're just trying to scheme something. They're trying to get me away from Jerusalem. They're trying to do something to get me away so they can attack me." Now, some people have said, well, maybe Nehemiah is a little bit extra paranoid. Maybe he's freaking out that, like, oh no, they're still trying to hurt me. We can't trust them anymore. But I don't think that's the case here. Nehemiah isn't overthinking anything. He's not overreacting. He's not doing that here. He's saying, wait a second, these guys are not stopping. Just because the walls are completed doesn't mean these guys are going to stop. They're not going to try to just stop the work. And why are they wanting me to come out of the city walls? Because remember, within the city walls, Nehemiah is protected. He has the guards, he's got all the men, all the women, like all the people that live in Jerusalem, they're there to protect him. And so he's saying, wait a second, I'm not going to fall for this trick here. I'm not going to fall for this little scheme that these men are trying to do here. But also, what could happen on this is that Nehemiah, when he leaves, it's not just, oh, maybe they kidnap him or take him hostage or assassinate him while he's away, but it could be a trick where these men saying, oh, yes, we want to make a treaty. They come together and then the men move into the city of Jerusalem, but then they take over the city from the inside out. And so those were just some theories that have been presented about their scheme against Nehemiah. So Nehemiah rejects this invitation, and it's not just once. He does it 4 times because Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, they said, hey, we're still going to win this battle. It doesn't matter that the walls are built. We will win this battle. We will overcome Nehemiah. We're going to continue on telling him, hey, come meet us. We want to talk with you. Nehemiah said, nope, I'm not going to talk with you. I'm busy doing this wall thing. I'm busy taking care of the people here. Like, I'm not going to leave my city. 4 times Nehemiah did that. Seemed like these 3 men, the enemies of Nehemiah, were just not getting the message. They weren't understanding that Nehemiah was not going to leave. And so then they send a 5th letter, which is our second point, letter to Nehemiah. So another letter to Nehemiah, and this starts in verse 5 and it goes to verse 9. So I'm going to read that here. So starting in verse 5. Then the 5th time, so this is the 5th letter that these men sent. The 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was another unsealed letter which was written. It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are rebuilding the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. there is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king. So come, let us confer together. In verse 8, I sent this reply. Nothing like that, nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of sorry. You are just making it up out of your head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. So we see here a fifth letter was sent to Nehemiah. So it's not just the same letter that has been sent the last 4 times, but we also see an additional letter. This letter was, number one, it was unsealed. That's really interesting, isn't it? Why is it unsealed? I mean, even today, if you get an unsealed letter, that seems a little weird, isn't it? Like if you open up your mailbox and your letter have been opened, it's like, what's going on here? Who read my mail? See, during this time, people would seal the letters. Now we wouldn't have the specialty, the little glue that we'd have to lick on the envelope and then we can seal it shut. They would have a specialty wax that they would seal the letter together to make sure that it wasn't opened, that only a certain person could open it. But this one was unsealed, probably to scare off a bunch more people who lived in Jerusalem. That it was read out loud, that it was meant to scare a lot more people than just Nehemiah. And in this letter, we see Sanballat telling Nehemiah that's like, hey, we heard you're trying to start a revolt, trying to rebel against the king of Persia. And if you remember, the king of Persia is also Nehemiah's boss. Remember in Nehemiah chapter 1 and 2, Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer to the king. And he had to ask special permission from the king to travel to Jerusalem. And not just this revolt was happening, but Sanballat was saying, hey, you're telling all these prophets here to proclaim that there's a king in Judah, that you are supposed to be their king now. And Nehemiah is like saying, no, that's not true. You're making this up. I'm not trying to become their king. I'm not trying to rule over them. I'm not trying to start a revolt. I'm just trying to get Jerusalem back to being a healthy city for them to no longer live in disgrace. Which then this confirms everything that Nehemiah was suspecting earlier. How the enemies of Nehemiah were just trying to plot and scheme against him and the city of Jerusalem. That they weren't trying to really come together as one nation, trying to be one group. They were still trying to scheme. But more about that, it wasn't just toward Nehemiah to frighten him, but it was probably also towards the people of Jerusalem, the people that were still there. As we see this in verse 9, they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands, as in the people of Jerusalem, their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. So the fear aspect is what Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem were trying to use here. They were trying to scare the people of Jerusalem, because for a rebellion, if there was any whiff of a rebellion that the king of Persia gets, they ended like that. They get rid of any sort of rebellion. They would just destroy the people just thinking about rebellion. And so Nehemiah was not only denying all these accusations because A, it was untrue, but also it's like, yo, I'm denying everything. There's no rebellion here. I'm not trying to do anything. But also not just to Nehemiah, but also to the people. Because if the people start getting scared, maybe they won't work as well, and maybe they might run away too. But then what do we see Nehemiah's reaction with all of this? It's at the end of verse 9, which says, "But I prayed, now strengthen my hands." That's a very short prayer, but very profound. Throughout this time, we have seen Nehemiah just go to God in prayer. He did that in chapter 1, as he heard about the city of Jerusalem. We see that in chapter 2 when he's confronted with the king. And we've seen this throughout the book thus far, where Nehemiah just goes to God in prayer when he's faced with difficult times. And when he's now faced with enemies making these accusations, he just says, "Now strengthen my hands." That's his go-to strategy, his go-to attack, quote unquote, attack. He's not really attacking, but he's going to God in prayer. But the intimidation doesn't stop there. We get to our third point, verses 10 through 14, where we see the intimidation to Nehemiah. So again, starting in verse 10, I'm just going to read that section here. "One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Deliah, the son of Mateba." Please forgive me on the pronunciation of these names. "Who was shut in his home. He said, 'Let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you.' But I said, 'Should a man like me run away? Or should one like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go.'" Verse 12, "I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me, because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this. And then they would give me a bad name to discredit me." Verse 14, "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, oh my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who have been trying to intimidate me." So this person, Shemaiah, probably a prophet who lived in Jerusalem, and as we saw here, was hired by Sanballat and Tobiah to intimidate Nehemiah. And so what Shemaiah did, he decided to shut himself inside his house, probably to make it look like his life is under attack as well, that he is also in danger, so he's trying to protect himself. And so then he invites Nehemiah to his place and tries to convince him, "Hey, how about you go hide in the temple? How about you do that? We'll close the doors. You stay hiding in there. You can protect yourself, because people are trying to kill you." Now, sure, at first that sounds like maybe he's trying to protect Nehemiah. He's trying to say, like, "Hey, protect yourself. It's okay. Like, hide yourself. People are trying to kill you." But Nehemiah wasn't going to fall for this intimidation, not going to fall for this other trick. See, Nehemiah realized two things. Number one, this would discredit him as a leader. And we see this here. It's at the end of verse 10. It would give him a bad name to discredit me. That's what Nehemiah is saying. It's like, if I were to do this, that's going to discredit my leadership. Why have I been talking about, hey, we can do this. We'll fight back. We can prepare ourselves for an attack. We'll continue building the wall. And he's been a pretty good leader throughout this whole time. If he were to hide, then it would discredit him as a quality leader. No one else would follow him after that. But on top of that, Nehemiah didn't have access to the temple. And I'm not saying, oh, he didn't have a key. I'm saying it's because he was not a prophet. Remember, there's only certain people that are allowed inside the actual temple. Nehemiah was not one of them. So Nehemiah knew that if he were to hide himself in the temple, he would be sinning against God. And so Nehemiah realized, wait a second here, this guy, he's trying to intimidate me. He was hired by my enemies. He's trying to make me not only, he's trying to make me a bad leader, but also sin against God. And so Nehemiah was not going to be having any part of that. He was not going to fall for this type of trickery. Which then brings us to our final point today, which is the courage of Nehemiah. This is our last point today. The courage of Nehemiah, verses 15 through 19, which says, so the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. I'm going to stop right there for verse 15. So the walls were completed in 52 days. There's only one word to describe that. Wow. 52 days. If we remember the map that we had earlier in this series, that we looked at the dimensions of the wall, that the wall was probably a total of a mile around. So if you did the whole wall, it probably took about a mile. Nehemiah had numerous work sites in the wall. He had several people working on the wall. And it took a total of 52 days. Friends, do you know how fast that is? Today, you couldn't even get a permit in 52 days, let alone the project completed. But they got the walls completed in 52 days. Friends, I don't know if you have a pen with you. Something I put down in my Bible here, I just put down, that's fast. With exclamation point, triple underline, it's like, wow, that is fast. So continuing on, starting with verse 16, when all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. So all the enemies realized that God was with them. They understood that Yahweh was with them. Probably remember last week when we were looking at Nehemiah 5, where, if you remember, where Nehemiah realized that Jews were taking advantage of other Jews, how did he react? He was angry. He was outraged. But he took a few moments to calm down, and then he figured out the problem. He fixed the problem after he calmed down because of his anger. But here in verse 16, we see that all the enemies heard about this, that the wall was completed, and all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence. They were afraid. They didn't calm down. They didn't relax. They just stayed afraid because they realized God was with these people. He was with Nehemiah. He was with the city of Jerusalem as they completed this wall, as they were working on this wall. God was with them the whole way, and Nehemiah stayed true to God this whole time. But Did the intimidation stop there? No, unfortunately. Picking up in verse 17, it says, also in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under an oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechemiah, son of Era, and his son Jehohanan, and married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Becherah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds, and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. So the people that we just saw here, all these unique names, these were people that lived inside the walls of Jerusalem, who most likely helped build the walls. But they said, you know what? Let's send the letters to Tobiah. Let's send letters to him. Hey, he's family. These people here, they were relatives of Tobiah, most likely through marriage. Like maybe like a brother or a sister through marriage and everything, but they were relatives of Tobiah, and they were reporting all the things that Nehemiah was doing. They were telling Tobiah all the things that Nehemiah said and did, and Tobiah was sending letters back to them. And these people kept on trying to convince Nehemiah that Tobiah, you know what, he's not such a bad guy. He's a cool dude, you know. How about we invite him over for our barbecue next weekend? Like, get to know him a little bit. He's all right, you know. Just sit down and talk with him. He's a great guy. Even though Tobiah tried to scheme against him, assassinate him, harm him in any way, he's a good guy. He's not that bad, you know. But yes, Nehemiah was still not gonna fall for this intimidation, this false information. He kept on focusing on his task, on what God had called him there to do. He was not going to be convinced by all these different types of intimidation, because God was with them. And so there are two application points that we see from this account. The first one is, even when the job is done, Satan does not stop working. I'm going to say that again. Even when the job is done, Satan does not stop working. As we saw here, it said it twice, how the walls were completed. We saw at the beginning of the chapter, in chapter 6, where it said that the enemies heard that the walls were completed. And then we saw it in verse 15, that the walls were completed within 52 days. But friends, just because the project is done does not mean that the enemies stopped working. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem were still scheming and plotting to get rid of Nehemiah. And the same thing goes with Satan. Do you think when one becomes a Christian, do you think Satan says, oh, I lost. I won't try to tempt them anymore. I won't try to convince them to go away from Christ anymore. I'm just going to leave them alone. Satan works all much harder. Satan does not stop working because someone becomes a Christian. He will continue tempting. You continue confusing people. Satan does not stop working even though the job is done. And then finally, do not let the enemy intimidate you with false information. People tried to keep Nehemiah from completing the wall this whole time. Whether if it's trying to intimidate him, trying to give the false information in terms of like, hey, like we heard you're trying to build a rebellion here. That's why you're building the walls. Hey, like why are like all these people here, like they're starving, they're doing all these bad things. The Jews are taking advantage of other Jews. There's a lot of stuff going on. Don't be intimidated by bad information. Don't be intimidated by the enemy trying to scare you, trying to frighten you. And besides, no one could truly find anything wrong with Nehemiah. As we saw at the end of the chapter, people were sending letters to Tobiah of all the things that Nehemiah was doing, but they could not find a single bad thing. Does that remind you of something? People trying to find anything bad about a person, but they could not find a single thing wrong with the person. They didn't say anything wrong, didn't do anything wrong, but they were upset by this person. Does that sound familiar? Jesus. The Pharisees spent so much time trying to figure out, what is Jesus saying? What is he doing? We got to figure out, what is he saying that is causing people to sin? And it's like, wait a second, he's not saying anything that's against the law. He's not talking about sin. He's not promoting sin, but we hate him anyway. And they hated him so much, they wanted to arrest him and they wanted him dead. That's what happens when God's people are following God. When we follow God, we're not doing anything wrong. We're not sinning. When we follow Christ, true to the letter, it'll make people upset. And the only comeback that they have for the reason why they're upset is because they just don't like it that we're following Christ. They don't like that idea. Well, friends, that doesn't become our problem. That's their problem. So, friends, remember, Satan is still at work. It doesn't matter if you've been a Christian for 5 minutes or 50 years, Satan is still at work. And the second thing is that we should not be intimidated by the false information the enemy provides. Stay focused on God with your walk with God, and your projects will get completed when you follow him. Let us pray.